A very specific topic here that really determines your practice that you need to pay attention to, and that's statistics. What statistics to keep, how to keep them. So we're going to spend a couple sessions going over the statistics. There's a couple things that are real determining factors when I talk to a potential new client or a chiropractor that tells me immediately how well they're doing. And I tell you two of them. I'll ask two questions that'll tell me. One is, are they doing staff meetings? They're not that- you can just on it. And number two is statistics. I'm surprised how many times I'll ask simple statistics, like how many patient visits do you see a week, or what's your average number of new patients? Just what are considered normal statistics normal statistics that the doctor doesn't even know. And there's just a rule. To grow your practice, you have to know your statistics, and then your statistics determine what you do. So not only do you want to keep statistics, you got to know certain statistics, but then you got to know how to interpret the statistics to find out, what may be inhibiting you um, to your next growth phase. Remember, it's pretty easy to grow a practice when you know the formula. So when you take, and I'm going to just share it with you right now, when you take the seven major categories, remember, a chiropractic practice has about seven different stages of growth. Seven. From the time you start to not practicing and have full-time associate doctors and just managing. There's seven different stop gaps along the way. And again, most chiropractors aren't aware of this. And usually there's one of seven reasons that becomes a limiting factor. So we pay attention to those seven factors. And then we pay attention to the layout, space, labor, and equipment. And then we will consider the statistics. So when I look at your space, labor, equipment, your layout, and I look at the seven major categories that pretty much where there'll be a stopgap, and then I look at your statistics, that tells me exactly where you are and exactly what you need to do to break through and get to the next level. And most times chiropractors don't realize that. They always think it's new patients, new patients, new patients. I'm like, no. I'll give you a couple examples. Is right now I've got a client. Well, he started with me. He was at 70 visits a week, and he started me with me doing personal injury. So, he was frustrated. His practice wasn't growing any. Uh, so I go, well, wait a minute. Let's do your statistics and see where you're at. Well, it turns out he was losing like two-thirds of his patients by the sixth visit. I go, you don't need personal injury. You need patient retention. So the very first thing we did, I said, why don't we just step back and let's just look at your whole picture and see where you're at instead of just randomly shooting in the dark. And unfortunately, that's what happens too many times. And you won't get very far doing that, by the way. And even if you break through, if you didn't solve the solution, you'll always drop back down to that lowest level. If you didn't solve the problem that inhibited your growth, and let's say you accidentally do shoot up, you'll drop right back down to that lowest level. So anyway, using his as an example, we looked at his space, his labor. So his labor was fine for seeing 70 visits a week. He just had one person. And then he had terrible space layout. He had individual rooms. I'm like, no, we can't do that. You got to go to a therapy bay. And so we had to make the structure of the office more feasible to see more patients. And then the system that he was using for patient retention wasn't very good. So we applied the three phases of healing relative to the therapeutic protocol, relative to the therapy bay. So now he was positioned where he could see a lot more patients at the same time, et cetera. In his old layout, he couldn't. Okay. So then we took patient education And we started working on that. Well, that shot them up to, it was like what, 140 a week. And like, it was fast. It was like in like 3 or 4 weeks. We're just unbelievably fast. Well, his next problem now is second labor. So now they're running their butt off. His front desk person's running their butt off, putting people on and off therapy, answering the phone. And you can't run a practice like that. You can't grow a practice like that. So I said, your next step is to get labor. And usually that's the problem. One of the problems at 120, 130 visits is to free the doctor up to see more visits. So then we got another person, and then he did a certain specific marketing, and that took it up to 200 visits a week. So now he's struggling at 200 visits a week, and he's pointing in the wrong direction. He's looking at everything else but what he needs to fix. I said, you're at your max. That's it. I mean, you're running right against the wall of exchanging time for money. I said, there's a few things, tweaks you can do to start leveraging your time. You can have a staff member start doing the preliminary consultations, the preliminary examinations. You can have a staff member do the patient education, have them take x-rays. All those things help a lot with leveraging time. And you'll be able to see more patients and eke out, a few more, like probably another 50 visits a week, or even just a little higher than that. But you're still going to run your back against the wall. And go until you get that second full-time person, you're going to have these limiting factors, the second full-time person. But now you're associate doctor. I said, your back's against the wall. You're doing everything. You've got your systems in place, you got your marketing in place, you got your patient retention in place. I said, you've got to leverage your time for money. You need now another associate doctor. Another staff member's not going to do it. In other words, we stair-stepped it all the way up to that point. And now he's looking for his associate doctor. So that's the next step. So there were all different problems along the way. So there's 7 different levels of growing a practice. And the limiting factor will either be primarily space, labor, equipment, knowledge or skill, motivation, or HR, human resources. That's one of the 7 problems. And then you go, okay, you look at your layout, your space, your equipment, everything. You look at the stopgap, and then you look at the statistics. So you combine, it's a combination of looking at your statistics. Like in that particular situation, if we wouldn't have looked at statistics, he'd have just been chasing his ass. That's all he'd going on. And that's what most chiropractors are doing. They're just chasing their ass because they're not going to the problem. You don't just start jumping at solutions when you don't even exactly know the problem. So that's the very first thing, is you got to do an in-depth evaluation. And so you look at your space, your labor, equipment, your knowledge, your skill, your HR resources. In other words, is the factory up? Is the factory up? Can the factory process? And then you look at your marketing, what marketing's going on to push people through the factory, so to speak, if all that's in place. And then you look at your statistics to find your weakest link. And so that's how you can grow your practice from maximizing your exchange of time for money. And then you want to especially look at your statistics when you want to start growing your amount of money per unit of time. And then you start leveraging your time and money through staff members and associate doctors, satellite offices, selling offices. So if you understand that formula and you just keep looking to that formula for the problem that's limiting you, and remember, you should look at your office as every quarter, every 3 months. What should happen every 3 months in your practice? You should have either put in place a system that's going to grow your revenue in the next quarter, or you've grown your revenue the next quarter. See, every quarter, every 3 months, that's how you should look at your business. Did my revenue grow because of something that I put in place the last quarter, or am I putting something in place this quarter to help it grow for the next quarter. If you were stagnant in 2 quarters, you're not increasing your revenue, or you're not putting systems in place that's going to increase your revenue in the next quarter. You're now stagnant. And you don't want quarter after quarter stacking up like that. That's when you'll just be stagnant the rest of your life. That's a miserable place to be. Just being stuck in the same rat wheel every quarter, every year, year after year after year.